Hello, grade 2 students. Welcome back to our class. Materials needed: math textbook and pencil. Chapter 15, Lesson 5. Divide rectangles into equal squares. Textbook pages 883 to 886. At the end of the lesson, the students are expected to divide rectangles into equal squares. Let us review polygons. Polygons can be described by their number of sides and angles. Example of polygons: we have quadrilaterals, pentagons, and hexagons. Please remember that the number of angles of polygon is the same as the number of sides and the number of vertices. Grade 2 students, are you ready? Let's start learning. Please open your book on page 883. Solve and share. How many equal squares cover this rectangle? How could you show this with an addition equation? So the total equal squares, we have 20. Equation, we have 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 20. This equation shows that we just added the numbers of squares in each row to find the total.
How many red squares can cover this rectangle? Begin like this. Not like this. Why must the squares be laid out the way they are in the top rectangle? The squares must be laid out the way they are in the top rectangle because the goal is to find the total number of red squares that exactly cover the rectangle. So there can be no gaps or overlaps. Count. Each row has 4 squares. How many rows are there? There are 3 rows. You can add the squares by rows. How many squares in all? 4 plus 4 plus 4 equals 12. There are 12 squares in all.
There is another way to count the squares.
Count. Each column has 3 squares. How many columns are there? There are 4 columns. You can add the squares by columns. 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 equals 12. There are 12 squares in all. Now you know how you can divide rectangles into equal squares.
Each row has 4 squares. How many squares are in each row? There are 4. How many rows are there? There are 3. We can add the squares by rows. So we have 4 plus 4 plus 4. We have 12. Next, how many squares are in each column? There are 3. How many columns are there? There are 4. So we can add the squares by columns. So we have 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 equals 12. Let's start learning. Please open your book on page 884. Explain how you can divide a rectangle into equal squares. Number 1. Begin in a corner. Make rows and columns of squares that touch side to side. Then, count and add the squares by rows or columns. For your guided practice, please open your book on page 884. Number 1. Use square tiles to cover the rectangle. Trace the tiles. Column 1 is done for you. Number 2. Count and add. How many squares cover the rectangle? Add by rows. So there are 3 rows. Each row has 6 squares. So we have 6 plus 6 plus 6 equals 18. Add by columns. There are 6 columns. So we have equals 18. For your independent practice, please open your book on page 885. Use square tiles to cover each rectangle. Trace the tiles. Count the squares. Number 3. First, add by rows. There are 4 rows, and in one row, there are 5 squares. So we have equals 20. Next, add by columns. So there are 5 columns. In one column, there are 4 squares. So we have equals 20. Next, number 4. Add by rows. How many rows? There are 4. In one row, there are 4 squares. So we have 16. Next, add by columns. So there are 4 columns. In each column, there are 4 squares. So we have, the answer is 16. We are still on page 885. Number 5. Draw a rectangle that is divided into 6 equal squares. So we have here sample answer. For your math practices and problem solving, please open your book on page 886. Let us answer number 6. Lisa bakes cornbread. She cuts it into equal square pieces. How many equal squares do you see? Write 2 equations to show the total number of square pieces. First, we can add by rows. So there are 6 rows. In each row, there are 4 squares. So we have here 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 equals 24 pieces. We can also add by columns. There are 4 columns. In each column, there are 6 squares. So we have 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 equals 24 pieces. Number 7. Label the columns and the rows for the large square below. So we have here rows, and then we have columns. Number 8. Look at the large square in item number 7. What do you notice about the number of rows and the number of columns? Explain. The number of rows and columns is equal because it's a square. Number 9. Count the equal squares in the rows and columns of the rectangle. Then use the numbers on the cards to write the missing numbers in the equations. So we have here rows. We have 7 plus 7 equals 14. There are 2 rows. In each row, there are 7 squares. So we have 7 plus 7 equals 14. Columns, there are 7 columns. In each column, there are 2 squares. So we have equals 14. A rectangle can be divided into rows and columns of squares that are all the same size. You can count or add in different ways to find the number of squares. You can add by rows or you can add by columns. Thank you.